efforts in particular were all hands on deck efforts. Much of the work that people think of during fire season is conducted by either ODF or OSFM, Oregon Department of Forestry, the Oregon State Fire Marshal. But so many of the responses that we had to those two fires required working with ODOT on clearing lanes of I-84 during the Eagle Creek fire, working with DEQ, ultimately working with ODFW on issues of water supply and threats to water supply of some of our hatcheries. And working with Business Oregon in recovery efforts. Specifically, I think of working with Business Oregon on grants and aspects of recovery to the water supply of Brookings and water quality, making sure that we were protecting the water quality in the Chetco River. So these efforts, both Chetco Bar and Eagle Creek Fire, I think, called to mind that these are all hands-on-deck efforts. They stretch beyond just our emergency response and our forestry agencies to many, many agencies, and they are events that, as has been recognized here on the panel already, cross the urban-rural divide, unite communities, unite Oregon in recognizing that there are challenges on the landscape. I'd also cite that it was that much of the conversation around wildfire references our neighbors to the south, California, and the Paradise Fire. And it's an often heard quote that we don't want to see a paradise here in Oregon. And that is true. And it certainly had crossed my mind when the town of Merlin was threatened by fire in, I think, last fire season. But ultimately, it was, I think, the 2018 fire season that most informs the formation of the council, and specifically the Substation Fire. I will call again, as we went around, as you did your introductions, many of you referenced the number of trees in your district. But in my recollection, much of what led to the impetus for the council was a wheatland fire, a fire that burned through wheat scrub. And we do well to not forget that on the eastern half of the state, we have RFPAs and volunteers fighting rangeland fires that often are large in size, threaten human structures, and threaten human life. And ultimately, the Substation Fire tragically did take a life of a neighbor defending his neighbor's property by cutting a fire line with a tractor. But the element of the Substation Fire that I think called to mind the need for a new approach was the fact that it began on what is characterized as unprotected land in which there is not an immediately identified first responder. But because we are neighbors, what happens when a fire breaks out on unprotected land is people do respond. People show up to fight it. And ultimately, the state did respond. Resources were sent in that to fight the Substation Fire or contain the Substation Fire, including aviation resources and people on the ground. And ultimately, those resources are the same resources that the state relies on to fight the fires that we think of more commonly: forest fires, fires on the west side, fires in southwestern Oregon. And when we think about the challenge ahead of us, one of the challenges is how do we update a system that was built for the past century to a system that is built for the current century, or for the path ahead, recognizing that we are neighbors and that we will send resources to defend and protect human structures and human life in unprotected land. And sometimes that is brushland, sometimes that is wheatland. And so that, in my mind, more than anything else, led to the executive order that the governor issued in January of 2019, which, citing a changing climate, the drought that comes from a changing climate, and population increase, change in population, has led to more dramatic fire seasons than we have seen in the recent past, particularly from about 2012 to 2019, the incidence of fire and the acres burned on the ground has been dramatically higher than the couple of decades before that. And so in response to a changing climate and population change, an executive order was issued establishing the Governor's Council on Wildfire Response and asking for recommendations to build a sustainable model for a path forward, a sustainable funding model, a sustainable response model for a path forward, but also to recognize a holistic model. As I mentioned, so many agencies are drawn in when fire occurs, and so many elements of our communities are drawn in when fire occurs. Any response built for the future, built for a changed climate, and built for a changed population requires a holistic approach. That's my reflection on how there came to be a council and how there came to be council recommendations you'll be hearing today. But lastly, I wanted to offer some observations from having been in the meetings over the course of the past 10 months. And those are really three. First, what I heard, so many hundreds of Oregonians contribute to, was a recognition that we can do something. This is not a problem. This is not a situation that is inevitable. There are actions that can be taken. We can bend the curve of wildfire. We can protect human population and protect human structures. We can take actions that are holistic and comprehensive to address some of these issues. And secondly, I would say I observed that we should do something. Wildfire is natural. We did, as acknowledged by the impetus to change the name of this committee, fire does occur on the landscape. It's part of our history. It's part of Western ecosystems. It's a natural part of both forest and rangeland ecosystems. But in the face of a changed climate and a population that has, despite our comprehensive land use laws, has in many ways grown into the wild and urban interface or other areas that are threatened by fire, we should take action to make sure that we're building a holistic, adaptive society that can respond to wildfire when necessary, can work with wildfire when it provides a restorative aspect to our ecosystems, but also recognizes that in many ways we've currently lost the social license to allow wildfire to burn in wild areas. When areas of the Rogue Valley are inundated by a blanket of smoke for 6 to 8 weeks, threatening the economy as well as human welfare and human health, that social license to recognize the truth that wildfire is part of our ecosystems is momentarily lost, and we need to bend that curve to restore trust and confidence that we can work with these ecosystems in a way that both restores forests and allows our economies and populations to thrive. And the last observation from being in those meetings that I'll offer is that the recommendations and the conversation that happened in that room, I think, at their best, reflect what neighbors would do to help each other. And as Senator Golden and Senator Berchiger just acknowledged, your districts neighbor each other. And I think what I heard loud and clear in that room is many of the actions that we can take include things like hardening structures, changing building codes, protecting the wild and urban interface, taking actions, neighbors taking actions around their individual property, or neighbors being incentivized to take action around their individual property that ultimately helps protect the property next door, their town, their city. If an ember carried by the wind ignites your roof, your house is an immediate threat to the house next to you. If the area immediately around your house is not well defended and it catches fire, you are immediately a threat to the neighbor next to you. So these are recommendations, ultimately, I think, at their best, and I think the way that I view them are less recommendations to an aspired future, but more recommendations to all of us, recommendations to the governor, recommendations to the legislature, but recommendations to all Oregonians as to what we can do as neighbors to help protect our neighbors from a future that will include wildfire, but does not need to include the loss of human life or the loss of human structures. I will be returning. With that, I will hand it over to Chair Dunn again, and I think we'll be returning at the end of the presentations from council members to field any questions. Thank you.